privilege for me to be here. So I was asked to address whether there's still a need for Black History Month. And in order to be able to assess that question, I think we have to start with the purpose of Black History Month. Now, you have in your program a brief description of that purpose. Dr. Carter Woodson, back in 1926, was painfully aware at how the books that we had and the popular images aggressively failed to include African Americans in terms of their realities and achievements. And so he conceptualized this notion of Negro History Week as a means to usher in interest and study and awareness of Black contributions in this country. Now let's fast forward to 1976. You heard about every president commemorating Black History Month, but it was at that point that there was an expansion of Negro History Week to Black History Month. And surprisingly, Gerald Ford, who was president at that time, at the bicentennial of this country, at the 50th anniversary of Negro History Week, said these words as he ushered in the notion that we would have Black History Month. He urged all Americans to seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. And now let's move to the present. 2016, right here, right now. Can we truthfully say that the study of African Americans and their contributions to this society have been treated with equal dignity to that of white Americans and other Americans? Sadly, we know the answer to that question, and it is a resounding no. Now, as we say in my profession, and I have to act like a lawyer because I am a lawyer, I could rest my case right now in terms of why there is still a need for Black History Month. But I'm going to go a little bit further, because it is very clear that we need a universal understanding that the words Black History Month are not an oxymoron. That Black people didn't just make history. Black people made history for themselves, for this country, and indeed globally, because the footprint cast by African Americans in every field that you can imagine is indeed global. And while we've had an undeniable decline in the amount of systemic, institutionalized racism in this country, we still need Black History Month to cure us and to rid us of what I would call the residual racism, the racism hangover that still infects the minds of people in this country and precludes us from fully realizing our capability of treating each other as human. Now, more specifically, I want to talk about the need for Black History Month with 4 different topics that I want to address. One is invisibility, the other is ignorance, the other is stereotyping, and the other is denial. On invisibility, I want to start by saying this. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone. I am invisible, understand? Simply because people refuse to see me. They only see my surroundings. Themselves are figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. These were the words written by Ralph Ellison in The Invisible Man in 1952. Now, of course, when Ellison wrote about invisibility in that famous novel, he was speaking figuratively on that topic. He was speaking about an invisibility which is a manner in which African Americans are perceived through a prism that denies their ability to self-express, to self-define, and to achieve full personhood. This is the prism that denies that African Americans have the same variety of emotions and experiences and thoughts as whites and others in the society, and causes people to view African Americans instead as sort of a monolithic Black person, a figment that isn't permitted to self-define but is merely an amalgam of different fears and suspicions and stereotypes that are projections of what a Black person is as opposed to achieving reality. In its most pernicious light, this prism essentially tells the society that it's perfectly acceptable to treat Black people as if they don't really exist. It's easier that way. It denies the notion that we should be concerned about the African American experience as far as hopes and aspirations, fears and concerns. It says that the Black person is merely just an object, but not an object of respect and recognition, not one that should receive compassion and intersubjectivity, but something that can simply be ignored. It's a form of existential death, this invisibility, because again, it denies our humanity. Is it at all surprising then, and a host of other injustices that are visited on the African American community without any sense of exigency to do anything about it? Well, of course it's not surprising, because when you dehumanize people and make them figments, you feel no need to have a call to action. And this subject of denying humanity makes me remember a trip that I took to Ghana. I was in Liberia to teach trial advocacy to members of the Liberian government as a part of a program fostered by the State Department. And I took a side trip to Ghana. I had to go. I had to go to Ghana because I wanted to go to Elmina, which is on the Cape Coast, where you could see the castles where they captured people, put them on slave ships, and brought them to the United States. And I saw some unspeakable things. If you ever have an opportunity to go there, you have to do it. One of the things that I recall being told is that if you tried to escape, and let's myth bust right there, black people didn't willingly get on those slave ships. They fought with all of their fiber because they knew the fate that was going to await them. But if you tried to escape, they would chain you 10 at a time and put you in a dungeon. Now, why 10 at a time? So that you would have to watch while each person to whom you were chained died one at a time until you were the last person. And this was in a room that was so small that you couldn't even stand up. The other thing that I remembered from that trip was being told that when the Europeans would rape the African women and they would have children, those women would be put in a bottom room. The children would be sent to an upper room where European clergy would teach them. The mothers could hear their babies, but they would never be allowed to touch or see their babies. And once they got well enough, they were shipped off to the New World in slavery. And as I stood there at that castle, and I went through the door of no return, and I played this in my mind again and again, I thought to myself, the only way that someone could inflict that type of brutality is that you had to believe that the people were not human. There's no other way that you can reconcile those things. You just couldn't do it as a sentient being. And then it made me think that if we could understand, all of us, not just black people, that that's the genesis of our voyage to this country. Every time we see an act of brutality, every time we see a denial of justice, we could say, have we not moved past the point where we deny the basic humanity of black people? Let that be a yardstick that we never want to approximate, that we want to get as far away from as possible. Now, in addition to adding faces, stories, and personalities that chip away at invisibility, Black History Month shakes people out of the invisibility syndrome by exposing the truth that black people have a multidimensional, fully formed history. And in counterbalancing the ethnocentrism and the revisionism that excludes black people from history books, it does something else. Black History Month prevents black people from being invisible to themselves because it allows black people to view themselves through the eyes of black people, as opposed to an extrinsic source. This sort of judging yourself and seeing yourself through someone else's eyes can induce a very painful, palpable self-alienation. And W.B. Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk in 1903 expounded on this phenomenon when he said the following: "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels this two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." It is in this respect that Black History Month stops the history that we learn from being his story, and instead compels it to be our collective story. And as long as that invisibility persists, there is a need for Black History Month. Ignorance. Black History Month removes the ignorance that black history is not real history, that is not important. It does this by asking, do you know who Jean-Baptiste Dussable is? Have you ever heard of Denmark Vesey? Have you ever heard of Mary McLeod Bethune and what contributions they made? Did you know that Alexander Pushkin, one of the most celebrated poets in Russian history, was a black man? I was in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia at the National Museum. His grandfather, Hannibal, was the Ethiopian and his family, and right in front of that museum, you walk in, there's a statue there of Alexander Pushkin. It also asked, do you know that the author of the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo was a black man, Alexandre Dumas? And it also asked, do you know that Malcolm Gladwell is a black man? That's right, the author of Blink and so many other novels that sprinkle throughout popular culture. And it asked, have you ever heard of Chevalier Saint-Georges? Chevalier Saint-Georges was one of the greatest fencers, athletes, classical music composers, and balloonists in 18th century France. And yes, he was also at the king's court. And yes, he was a black man. Now, I would ask only one thing, that society stop calling him the Black Mozart. And the reason I say that is because I'd like to think that if Chevalier Saint-Georges were alive and with us now, he would refer to Mozart as the white Chevalier Saint-Georges. Minus the athleticism, the fencing, the ballooning prowess, and his other feats. The Black History Month erodes this ignorance that says that history is compartmentalized, and that we appreciate, as I said earlier, that there can be no world history without black history. And it's not divisive. That's one of the barbs and attacks. Why would you have a segregated history? It's actually the exact opposite. Black History Month is a catalyst. A catalyst because it infuses in people the notion that there's a chapter in the human family that can't be ignored, with the goal of actually coalescing all of these histories so that we see the true quilt of humanity. Black History Month also removes the ignorance that says that black history is an elective as opposed to a mandatory course of study, that it's a specialization as opposed to an area of general knowledge, and that it's side stream as opposed to mainstream. Black History Month is mainstream, and it also allows black people to rid themselves of self-ignorance. Harriet Tubman once said, I freed thousands of slaves, and I could have freed thousands more if they had only known that they were slaves. I'm going to let that marinate for a second. Malcolm X, almost 100 years later, in a very provocative speech, asked, who are you? What did the man do to make you dumb? He was calling on people to understand that if you don't know where you came from, that you won't know where you're going. And in this respect, Black History Month also offers a sense of perspective that can prevent society from measuring black people's conditions and progress with a false yardstick. A yardstick that instead of looking at various indices with bewilderment and saying, well, why is it that African Americans lag in this place and in that place, as if there's no explanation, as if there's not a larger connection to, again, a societal history that is placed in anvil on the back of the necks of so many African Americans. Instead, you can look at this and you can realize that so many people came to this country to get a taste of freedom. We're the only people for whom the taste of freedom was taken out of our mouth the moment we got to this country. While the rest of the world was being colonized, we're the only people who experienced domestic colonization. And ironically, instead of welcoming black people with the sonnet, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, America was telling black people, I will make you tired, I will make you poor, and I will make you unable to breathe free. By reminding us of these enormous and ubiquitous challenges that African Americans have had to endure, Black History Month adds a much needed perspective that when we think about the accomplishments of African Americans, we're not just talking about accomplishments, we're talking about remarkable accomplishments by remarkable people who overcame remarkable obstacles. I kind of look at Black History Month in some respects as the ultimate survival guide. That if you have your back up against the wall, you're trying to achieve against all odds, you can look in the annals of Black History Month. And it counters the narrative that we are the failures of the American experience. And I know this because I told you I was in Ethiopia, and at one point when I was being toured, the person that was giving me the tour turned to me and said, I got to tell you, we are so proud of what you're doing in America. I said, what do you mean? He goes, we look at you, and Ethiopia, by the way, Addis Ababa is the seat of the African Union, so you have all the African countries there. we look at you as heroes. You guys are amazing. We see you going to the moon. We see you in politics. We see you in industry. We see you in sports. We see you in every avenue that you can possibly imagine. And we know the odds against which you did this. You're like roses in the desert. And that really touched me. It touched me to the point, it made me think about a poem by Robert Burns. A portion of it goes, "Oh, what some power the gift he gives to see ourselves as others see us." And he was basically talking about how we lack the ability to objectively view ourselves. And I was just thinking, I could only hope that black people could hear how we're viewed by Africans, people that are in the diaspora, that are still in Africa, that they look at us as heroes and sheroes, as testaments to survival and to the fortitude of the black spirit. So many times we don't get that perspective, but we desperately need to have it. And at the same time, by reminding us of how much was done with so little, Black History Month tells us that as a people, we have so much more to do with the opportunities and the potential that we have in this, fortunately, more enlightened chapter in our nation's history. Stereotyping. In speaking about negative images of African Americans in television and movies, Dr. Teron T. Smith, and I'll synthesize what he was saying, talks about how these negative images essentially justify the racial inequalities that African Americans encounter in institutions in the forms of inflated school discipline, underachievement in higher education, over-inclusion in the criminal justice system, and other experiences. This isn't just a faux pas, excluding people from award ceremonies or having a paucity of African American images on television and in the movies that are positive. It's far more than that. Some people have referred to it as cultural warfare. Some people have referred to it as a cultural genocide. But to be a plain speaker, just imagine, if you can, never seeing positive images of yourself in any popular media. Having to have a constant vigil against your integrity and your self-esteem. Because with every commercial, every magazine cover, every iteration of a chapter in a book, you're essentially told, this world is not for you. This world is not about you. You will not be loved. You will not be revered. You will not be respected. You will not be cherished as beautiful, resourceful, or intelligent. Imagine having to muster a positive self-image out of those conditions. And that's where Black History Month allows us to change the channel. Black History Month allows us to see a different movie. It allows us to flip the script. It doesn't placate racist beliefs, it challenges those beliefs, and it gives African Americans something to look to. To get personal for a second, I can remember being 7 years old, having to do a report, in fact, on Black History Month. And I can remember going to my family's bookshelf, pulling out a book, and seeing one chapter in particular on Thurgood Marshall. 7 years old. I read it in awe. It was the first time I ever read something that I couldn't put down. And I was committed at 7 to be a lawyer. I wanted to be Thurgood Marshall. I didn't want to be a ball player. I didn't want to be an actor. I wanted to be someone who, instead of crushing balls, was crushing segregation, was a champion of civil rights. At 7 years old, reading about Thurgood Marshall gave me a sense of courage. It gave me a sense of purpose. It gave me a sense of direction. I was born in 1965. This is 1972. Can you imagine what the landscape in the media looked like in terms of positive images? I often went to schools where I was the only black person in my class. Had to walk into those classrooms by myself. I also skipped 3 grades when I was in school, so I was 12 in the 10th grade. So imagine compounding that. And the only things that I had to encourage me were the positive images and encouragement that I got in my household and these images from Black history. So when you talk about the necessity of Black History Month, if it did that for me, hopefully it does that for others. And finally, denial. Black History Month is an antidote for denial, a denial of where we've been and where others are. At every Seder and Passover that's celebrated in Jewish households, there's a song, Avidim Chayinu Chayinu, which means we were once slaves. And it talks about how the children of Israel were building pyramids and were in slavery. And people at the Seder are asked to appreciate how far they've come and to respect their freedom and their gratitude for that freedom, and to acknowledge that there are others who are still experiencing some form of oppression, some form of maybe domestic violence, or victims of sex trades, or other unspeakable horrors. And many Seders include a plea that just as the taste of abuse is bitter in our mouth, that we do everything we can to pass that cup of bitterness from the mouth of others. Black history can and does serve the same purpose. It reminds us of where we've been and encourages us to do everything in our power to move the lives of those in our community and others forward to a better life. And Black History Month is also an antidote for denial of the fact that we still struggle with our nation's past. It's the conversation that won't go away. Because as long as we live in a society where we have situational justice, situational education, and situational opportunities, in other words, your ability to accrue those advantages is dependent entirely on your situation, as opposed to just desert and merit, the case for Black History Month and its necessity is made with each passing moment. Thank you.